The suspension started in February. It was March when I stopped pretending I was going to do anything productive with the time. NOAA's official language for what happened was failure to adhere to documentation standards, which is a clean way of saying I filed a report about something I saw and nobody wanted to have on record. What I saw was a mass, large, slow-moving, roughly 40 meters across, tracking along the lake bed south of Madeline Island at a depth that didn't match any known migratory pattern for anything in Lake Superior. I had sonar data. I had timestamps. What I didn't have was a single colleague willing to say they'd seen the same thing on their screens, even though two of them had been sitting right next to me. So, suspension, pending review, that's NOAA for go home and be quiet. I went home. I was not quiet exactly, but I was alone, which is close enough. My apartment in Duluth is fine. It's small and it faces the wrong direction. And the radiator makes a sound like someone dragging a chair across concrete every time it kicks on. But it's fine. I spent the first 2 weeks going back through my Sonar files. The third week I started pulling archived incident reports from the regional database. Anything flagged near the Apostle Islands going back 20 years. The fourth week I found the forum. I'm not going to pretend that's not embarrassing. It's a little embarrassing. The forum is called Lake Truth, and it looks like it was designed in 2004 and never updated. The header image is a blurry photograph of something in the water that's probably water. Most of the threads are about government satellites and weather modification. Not exactly my usual reading material, but there's a sub-forum called Superior Anomalies, and some of the posts in there are written by people who clearly spent real time in the water, specific depths, specific coordinates, kind of details that don't come from someone who's never held a sonar. I'd been lurking for about 2 weeks when the thread went up. The title was Caught Something in the Nets, Need Help Identifying. Posted at 2:47 in the morning by a user called Apostle Langler AE8. 3 images attached. I looked at them for probably 30 seconds before I understood what I was seeing. Then I looked for another 10 minutes. 3 figures in a net. Pale. Not just fair-skinned, but the kind of pale that means no sun exposure, ever, like something that had never been near a surface. Hairless, roughly human in proportion, but wrong in the specific ways that matter. Fingers fused together into flat, wide paddles. Eyes completely sealed over with what looked like a second layer of skin. Mouths too small. Nostrils nearly flush with the face. The gill slits were visible along the rib cage on the largest one. They were tangled in the net together, and whoever had taken the photos had done it from above, on the deck, looking down. The replies were what you'd expect. Photoshop, mannequins, elaborate prank. One guy said it was a viral marketing campaign for a movie. The original poster hadn't replied since uploading the images. I cross-referenced the account's previous posts, all fishing related, specific to the Apostle Islands area. Catch weights, equipment recommendations. One complained about fuel prices at the Bayfield marina. Not a troll account. Not someone building toward a reveal. I had my field bag packed in about 15 minutes. Waterproof jacket, cargo pants, the worn boots I've had since grad school. Recorder, notebook, external hard drive. I grabbed my NOAA badge out of habit, then looked at it for a second and put it back. I was suspended. Technically, I had no authority to be doing any of this. I went anyway. Highway 2 from Duluth to Bayfield is about 70 miles, and it's mostly fine until you get past Ashland, and the road starts doing things roads don't need to do. I drove it in just under 6 hours because I stopped once for gas and coffee from the BP station that had a hand-lettered sign in the window reading Wi-Fi down indefinitely. The coffee was bad. I drank all of it. I didn't call anyone. Didn't contact the Coast Guard. Didn't loop in the regional NOAA office. Didn't reach out to the National Park Service. I told myself it was because I didn't have enough to go on yet, which was true. I also told myself it wasn't because I'd burned enough bridges in the last 3 months that I wasn't sure anyone would pick up, which was less true. Bayfield in March is quiet in the specific way that tourist towns are quiet when the tourists aren't there. The main street was mostly closed storefronts and one open hardware store. The lake was visible at the end of almost every block, gray and flat and enormous. I'd worked this region for 4 years before the suspension. I knew the water here the way you know a road you've driven so many times you stop thinking about it. I found the forum post's location by working backward from the images. The net type was identifiable, a specific mesh gauge used almost exclusively for lake trout operations in the Apostles area. The boat visible at the edge of one photo had a particular style of stern railing I'd seen at the Bayfield commercial dock. It took me about 40 minutes of cross-referencing the harbor master's public mooring records on my phone before I had a name. The Carla Jean, registered to a Sean Jackson in Washburn. Gruenke's restaurant is on Rittenhouse Avenue, half a block from the water. It's the kind of place that's been there forever and smells like it. Coffee and bacon grease, and something underneath might be the building itself. I walked in at 8:15 in the morning, and they were all there. 4 of them at a round table near the window, eating eggs. Eating eggs like it was a normal Tuesday, like they hadn't pulled 3 impossible things out of the lake 12 hours earlier. I recognized Jackson from his harbor master registration photo. Big guy, weathered, the kind of face that's been outside in bad weather for decades. He looked up when I came in. I told the hostess I was meeting someone and walked to their table. I want to be clear that I'm not great at this part, the interview part. I'm good at the data side of things. I can read a sonar return or a water column sample and tell you something useful. Talking to people about things they don't want to talk about is a different skill, and I've never fully developed it. What I did was show Jackson the forum images on my phone. Didn't introduce myself first. Didn't explain what I was doing there. Just put the phone on the table in front of him and waited. He looked at them for a long time. The other 3 got quiet. "Where'd you get those?" he said. Not a question, really. "They're public," I said. "Posted last night." He picked up his coffee cup and put it down without drinking from it. "Who are you?" I told him I was a researcher, which was technically still true. I asked if we could talk separately, one at a time. He didn't say yes exactly, but he didn't say no, and when I pulled a chair to the corner booth at the back of the restaurant, he followed me over after a minute. The other 3 stayed at the table and watched. Jackson was straightforward. He'd pulled the net at around 11 the previous night, southeast of Sand Island, in about 90 feet of water. The figures were tangled together near the weighted end. His crew had cut them loose onto the deck. They were alive. He was certain about that. He said it without hesitation. They were breathing, slow and irregular, and they were warm to the touch. "How long were they on deck?" I asked. 20 minutes, maybe. Then they went back over the side. They went over on their own. One of them moved toward the rail. The other 2 followed. I wrote that down. "Did anyone touch them while they were on deck?" He paused there, just to be clear. "The kid did. The one who's been crewing with us the last few weeks." I looked up from the notebook. "What kid?" "Young guy. Not official crew, just helping out. Francis something." I put my pen down. Jackson kept talking. He said Francis had been untangling the net when the figures came up. That he'd had his hands on one of them for a few seconds before he realized what he was touching. That when he made contact, something had happened with the one closest to him. The sealed-over eyes had moved, tracking under the skin, turning toward Francis like they could see him through the lids. I picked my pen back up and wrote that down too. My handwriting was a little worse than usual. Francis Lucas is my brother. He's 26. The last time I talked to him was Christmas, and he hadn't mentioned anything about Bayfield or a fishing crew or any of this. He hadn't mentioned it because that's how Francis operates. He does things and tells you afterward, if he tells you at all. I interviewed Lance Harris next, then Nathan Roberts, who was visibly shaken and talked faster than the others. Then Patrick Noble, who spoke slowly and chose his words carefully and confirmed everything the others had said, including the part about Francis. None of them knew where Francis was right now. He'd left the boat when they docked, and they hadn't seen him since. I was sitting in a corner booth in a restaurant in Bayfield, with a notebook full of witness accounts and no idea where my brother was. I ordered a coffee I didn't drink and looked out the window at the street. I sat with the untouched coffee until it went cold. The street outside was doing nothing interesting. A pickup truck, a woman walking a dog, normal Bayfield stuff. I didn't know where to start looking for Francis. That's the honest answer. He hadn't checked in anywhere under his name. I'd already tried calling the 2 motels I knew of. Neither one had a Lucas on the books. His phone went to voicemail twice, then stopped entirely, which probably meant the battery was dead. That's Francis. Carries a phone that's always at 4%. I left Granky's around noon and drove down to the waterfront. Figured I'd at least look at the marina, see if anyone had seen me around the docks. Nobody had, or nobody said so. I walked the length of the harbor and back and wrote nothing in my notebook because there was nothing to write. Jordan Hansen's office was at the end of the Harbor Master building, a low brown structure that smelled like diesel and an old road. I'd called her that morning before I even found the crew, right after I'd driven into town. She was the only local official who picked up the phone and not immediately told me to contact the Coast Guard. She hadn't exactly believed me either, but she'd listened, which put her ahead of most people I'd dealt with in the last 3 months. She was at her desk when I knocked. 50s, short gray hair, the kind of face that's used to weather. She looked up and didn't say anything for a second. "You find the crew," she said. "Yeah, all 4 of them. Everything checks out." She nodded once. "And the brother?" "Still looking." She didn't push on that. I appreciate it. We talked for maybe 20 minutes. I went through the crew accounts. She asked a few practical questions about the net location and the approximate time of the catch. She had a map on the wall with the Apostle Islands marked out in red pen, various notations I didn't ask about. She said she'd keep an ear to the radio and let me know if anything came in. I gave her my cell number. She already had it from the morning call, but I wrote it on a sticky note anyway and left it on her desk. That's me. Redundant about contact information. She called at 9:47 that night. I was in my car in the parking lot of a motel on Manypenny Avenue, eating a gas station sandwich I'd bought 2 hours earlier and mostly ignored. The sandwich was turkey, I think. It's hard to say. "Something washed up," she said. "Below the visitor center, you should come." I was there in 8 minutes. The Apostle Islands National Lakeshore Visitor Center sits up on a rise above the water. There's a path that cuts down to the beach, wood chip surface, a little steep. I went down it in the dark with my flashlight and my field bag and my camera around my neck, and I could see another light already moving on the sand below. Hansen. She'd beaten me there, which made sense since she'd called from somewhere closer. The beach was empty except for her. Not a soul around. The water was doing its usual thing. Low waves. That particular lake superior center gets flattened and pulled in the ocean waves. Less dramatic. The sky had clouds across most of it, and the moon was behind. I saw it before I got to the waterline. It was about 6 feet long, pale, hairless. It was lying face up at the edge of where the water had last reached, half on wet sand and half on dry. The skin was the same color as the figures in the forum photos, that grayish white that doesn't look like any skin I've seen on anything. The hands were fused, fingers grown together into flat paddle shapes. The eyes were sealed over, the lids smooth and continuous. No lash line, no crease, just skin pulled across where eyes would be. Dead. Obviously dead. There was no movement, no chest rise, nothing. The way it was lying had a finality to it that I can't really explain except to say that living things don't arrange themselves like that. Hansen was standing a few feet back from it. "It came in with the last wave set," she said. "Maybe 20 minutes before I called you." I nodded and got to work. I photographed it from every angle I could manage. Full body, close on the hands, close on the face, close on the torso. The gill slits were along the rib cage, 3 on each side, running parallel to the ribs in a way that looked almost deliberate. Architectural. I photographed those separately and then got out my measuring tape. 6 feet and 1 inch, nose to heel. The calcified nodules started at the base of the skull and ran the length of the spine. Irregular spacing, the largest ones around the mid-back. I pressed one with my thumb. It didn't give at all, more like bone than cartilage. I photographed the nodules and wrote down the measurements and kept going. Hansen watched without saying much. She asked once if I needed more light, and I said yes, and she moved her flashlight to where I was working. That was the extent of our conversation for a while. The gill slits were sealed. Not injured sealed, just closed. Like they'd never been opened, or like they'd closed on purpose. I had a field knife in my bag that I used for taking samples. I opened the blade and looked at Hansen. "I want to cut into the gill slits," I said. She shrugged. "It's your documentation." I made a careful incision along the top slit on the left side. The tissue was denser than I expected. The knife went through, but it took more pressure than it should have. When the slit opened, fluid came out. Not much, maybe a tablespoon, dark and thin. It hit the sand and soaked in fast. Some of it landed on Hansen's boots. She looked down at it and then looked back at the creature. She said. That was it. Neither of us said anything else about it. I cut the remaining slits on the left side and documented each one. Same fluid, same color, same volume, roughly. I took a sample in a small collection tube I had in the bag. I don't know what I was going to do with it exactly. Old habit. You collect what you can and figure out the rest later. By the time I was done, it was past 11. I had 40-something photographs, a full page of measurements, a fluid sample, and a dead creature lying on a beach below a national park visitor center that wouldn't open for another 10 hours. I stood up and looked at what I had. 3 months ago, I'd filed a report about an unidentified mass moving below the surface near Madeline Island, and my own agency had treated it like I'd reported a UFO. Nobody had come to look. Nobody had signed off on following. They'd suspended me and waited for me to go away. I had a body now. Measurements, photographs, 40-something. I had witness accounts from 4 men who'd touched the net, and one of those men was my brother, and I still didn't know where he was. But I had this, standing on that sand with Hansen in the dark, with the lake doing its flat, cold thing behind us. I felt it, for the first time since March, like I was ahead of something instead of behind it. Like the situation had a shape I could work with. I didn't say any of that out loud. Hansen wasn't the type, and neither am I. "I'll make some calls in the morning," she said. "Keep this quiet until we know what we're dealing with." "Yeah," I said. "That works." I drove back to the motel and uploaded the photos to my laptop and backed them up to 2 separate drives, because I've learned things about institutional memory the hard way. Then I opened my notebook to a clean page and wrote down everything I could remember about the texture of the gill tissue and the color of the fluid and the weight I'd had to put behind the knife. I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about the nodules on the spine. The spacing wasn't random. I was pretty sure the spacing wasn't random. I wrote that down too, even though I didn't know yet what it meant. In the morning, I had a thread I needed to follow. Something one of the crew had said, Nathan Roberts, the one who talked fast and looked shaken, about a story he'd heard from a commercial diver who worked the Apostle Island circuit. An old wreck. Something that had happened to the crew that found him. I'd written it down as a side note and circled it twice without knowing why. I pulled up the Ashland County Historical Society's address on my phone. They opened at 9. The Ashland County Historical Society was on Main Street, which I'd already figured, and it opened at 9, which I already knew. I was there at 8:52, sitting in my car eating a gas station granola bar that tasted like cardboard and honey, watching a woman in her 60s unlock the front door with a key ring that had maybe 15 keys on it. She didn't look up. I gave her 3 minutes to get settled and then went in. The inside smelled like old paper and forced air. There was a front desk with a computer that looked like it was from around 2008, and behind that a room with shelves, and behind that another room I couldn't see into. The woman was at the desk. She had reading glasses on a beaded chair and a cardigan with a small embroidered bird on the lapel. A chickadee, maybe. I'm not a bird. Looking for anything specific? She said. Maritime records, I said. Specifically wrecks, Lake Superior, late 1920s. She didn't blink. Probably got that a lot, or something close to it. She typed something, looked at the screen, and typed again. We've got the county shipping logs from 1912 through 1945. A collection of personal papers from a few families with commercial fishing history, and some transferred materials from the Wisconsin Maritime Museum. What's the vessel? SS Dominator? I said. Lost in Whitefish Bay, 1929. More typing. She pulled off her glasses and let them hang. We do have a file. It came to us as part of a donation in the 80s. Mostly crew records and a partial survivor's account. It's not digitized. That's fine. She brought me to a reading room in the back. A folding table, 2 chairs, a lamp with a pull chain, and a sign on the wall that said, "Please use cotton gloves when handling original documents." She handed me a pair of cotton gloves and a gray archival box and led me to it. The box had a label on the side, SS Dominator, Whitefish Bay, November 1929. Donated materials, Hargrove Estate. I wrote that down. Inside, a manifest from the shipping company, water damaged and mostly illegible. A list of crew names typed on onion skin paper that had gone brittle at the edges. A folded newspaper clipping from the Ashland Daily Press, November 19th, 1929. With the headline, "Freighter Lost in Bay Storm. 1 survivor reported." And underneath all of that, in a separate sleeve of acid-free plastic, a handwritten document. 12 pages. The handwriting was small and very controlled, the kind of handwriting that takes effort, someone who practiced. The top of the first page said, "Account of P. Hamilton, sole survivor, SS Dominator, recorded November 22nd, 1929. I put on the cotton gloves and started reading. Hamilton wrote the way people wrote back then. Formal, careful, a little stiff. He described the voyage, the weather, the cargo. He described the evening of the 16th clearly and without drama, which I appreciated. The lake had been calm, he said. Unusually calm for the weather. The kind of calm that made the older crew members uneasy, though he didn't say why they were uneasy. Just that they were. Then he described the sound. He called it a rhythmic percussion originating below the vessel, consistent in interval, irregular in intensity. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats, pause. He wrote that it lasted approximately 40 minutes before the crew went to the rail to look. He wrote that he did not go to the rail. He wrote that he went instead to the crane deck and climbed into the diving bell, which was staged there for a survey job they were supposed to run the following week. He sealed the hatch. He stayed inside until morning. He didn't describe what happened to the rest of the crew in any detail. He wrote, "I did not witness the events directly. I heard them. I will not record what I heard, as I do not believe a written account would be useful to anyone, and I have no wish to produce one." That was the whole paragraph. Then he moved on. The last 2 pages were different, less formal. The handwriting got a little looser, like he'd written them later, or faster, or both. He described the inside of the diving bell, the dimensions, the hatch mechanism, the way sound traveled through the hull, And on the second to last page, there was a diagram, hand-drawn, pretty careful cross-section of the bell with measurements labeled. Hamilton had been thorough. In the margin next to the diagram, in slightly different ink, darker, maybe added later, there were 5 words. 3 knocks? They stopped. That was it. No explanation, no context, just that. I sat with it for a second. Then I photographed the page 4 times from different angles, made sure the margin note was legible in every shot, and photographed the rest of the document front to back. I thanked the woman at the desk on my way out. She was reading something and didn't look up, but said, which was fine. I sat in my car in the parking lot and looked at the photo of that margin for probably 3 minutes. 3 knocks. They stopped. Hamilton had survived the night by sealing himself in the bell. He'd heard whatever happened on deck, and at some point, before or after I couldn't tell, he'd figured out, or observed, or been told that 3 knocks made them stop. And he'd written it in the margin of a diagram instead of in the body of the account, which meant he either didn't think it was important or he didn't want it to be easy to find. I was leaning toward the second one. I pulled up Lake Superior Dive Company on my phone. They were in Duluth. They rented equipment and ran certification courses and did commercial survey work. Their website looked functional but not recent. I called the number and got a guy named Derek who sounded like he'd been awake for a while and was fine with that. I told him I needed a full cold water rig and a dive plan filed for a wreck survey in Whitefish Bay. He asked for my certification level. I told him. He said he could have equipment ready in 2 days. I drove to Duluth that afternoon. I spent the next 2 days doing what I do when I'm waiting and can't stop thinking. I read everything I could find about the Dominator wreck, cross-referenced Hamilton's account against the newspaper record, and tried to figure out where exactly the crane deck would be sitting on the lake floor after 90-some years. The wreck had been located by a dive survey in the 90s. There were coordinates in the public record. The bell had been noted in the survey report as present and largely intact. Crane attachment point corroded but holding. Someone had photographed it from the outside. Nobody had gone in. Derek at Lake Superior Dive Company was a solid guy. He didn't ask a lot of questions, which I respected. He checked my gear twice, which I also respected. He had a rental boat and a dive partner policy that he was willing to waive if I signed an additional form, which I did, because I wasn't bringing anyone down with me. The descent took about 20 minutes. The Dominator was sitting at around 110 feet, listed maybe 15 degrees to port, covering zebra mussels and algae, and a particular kind of stillness that deep freshwater wrecks have. It's different from saltwater, quieter somehow, less life, or different life. The crane deck was midship. I found it without much trouble. The bell was still there, hanging from the crane arm at about a 30-degree angle from where it would have been staged, which made sense. The list. The hatch was on the upper side. The exterior was fouled with growth, but the shape was intact. It was maybe 5 feet in diameter, smaller than I'd pictured from Hamilton's diagram. Getting the hatch open took a few minutes. The mechanism was corroded but not seized. I worked it slow and it gave. Inside was dark and close and full of silt that moved when I entered. I let it settle. I had a dive light, but I kept it low while the silt cleared. Then I saw it. It was sitting on the floor of the bell, half buried in sediment. Brass, from the look of it, still showing color under the growth. Cylindrical, maybe 10 inches long, with a rounded striking end and a flat grip end. The clapper, the kind you'd use to ring a bell, except this wasn't attached to anything. It had been placed there, left there. And around the grip, covering maybe 6 inches of surface, there were symbols cut into the metal, not decorative, deliberate. I didn't recognize any of them. I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. I held Hamilton's clapper in my hand at the bottom of Lake Superior and thought about a man who'd survived one night by sealing himself inside this exact space, who'd written down 5 words in a margin and hidden them where most people wouldn't look, and who'd left this here instead of taking it with me. I didn't know yet what the symbols meant. I still don't, fully. But I put it in my collection bag and started. I broke the surface, pulled my mask off, and reached for the ladder on the rental boat. Francis was standing on the deck looking down at me. Francis was just standing there. That was the first thing. Not moving, not waving, not doing anything you'd expect from someone who'd spotted a diver surfacing after a 40-minute bottom time. Just standing on the deck of the rental boat with his arms at his sides, looking down at me in the water. I had my mask pushed up on my forehead and I was reaching for the ladder, and I stopped for a second because his face was wrong. Not wrong like usual, panicked. Wrong like he was waiting for something and didn't know what it was. Francis, I said. He blinked, slow. Hey. I grabbed the ladder and pulled myself up. What are you doing here? He didn't answer right away. He watched me climb. I got my fins off and dropped them on the deck and started unclipping my BCD, and he still hadn't said anything. The rental boat was a 22-foot Lund with a center console and a live well that smelled like old bait. Lake Superior in October at the surface is cold enough that I was already shivering a little through the dry suit seams. I didn't care about that. I was looking at Francis. How did you know where I was? I asked. He said, I just knew. That was it. No explanation. No, I tracked your rental receipt, or Hansen told me, or I saw the boat from the shore. I just knew. Like that was a normal answer to give a person. I figured I'd come back to that. I set the BCD down and pulled off my hood, and that's when I saw his collar. He was wearing a flannel shirt, one of those thin ones, open at the collar. And just below the left collarbone, maybe 2 inches below the clavicle, there was a cut. Except it wasn't a cut. It was about 3 inches long, horizontal, with slightly raised edges. And it was bleeding slow and steady, in a way that didn't look like something that needed pressure. It looked like something that was supposed to bleed. The skin around it wasn't torn. It wasn't jagged. The edges were clean. I've seen gill slits on the figures we pulled up, on the one that washed ashore. I knew what I was looking at. Francis. I kept my voice flat. Take your shirt off. He did it without arguing, which was its own kind of alarm. Francis argues about everything. He argued with me for 20 minutes once about whether Chicago-style deep dish counts as pizza. He just pulled the shirt off and stood there in the cold lake wind, and I looked at the slit, and then I looked at his face. His pupils were huge. Not low-light huge. Not something's wrong medically huge. The kind of huge where there's almost no iris left, where the eye is mostly just black. It was 11 in the morning, and we were on open water with full overcast, and his pupils were the size of dimes. That part bugged me more than the gill slit, honestly. The slit was physical. The pupils meant something was running. I thought about what Hamilton had written, about the figures in the net, about Francis being the one who touched them while they were untangling the catch, and about the one whose sealed eyes had tracked him. They'd made contact, and now they were using that contact. I didn't say any of that to Francis right then. I just said, okay, put your shirt back on, we're going back to Bayfield. He put his shirt back on. He didn't ask why. He sat down on the bench at the stern and looked out at the water, and I started the engine and pointed us north. The drive back took about 40 minutes from where I'd anchored over the Dominator site. I kept one eye on Francis the whole time. He didn't do anything strange. He just sat there. Occasionally he'd look at the water, and his head would tilt a little, like he was listening to something. I turned the throttle up and tried not to think too hard about what signal relay meant in practical terms, meaning, if they were tracking me through it, they knew exactly where I'd been. They knew about the wreck. They probably knew about the bell. I had the clapper in my collection bag, still in my dry suit pocket. I kept my hand on it most of the way back. Hansen was at the harbor master's office when we got it. I'd called ahead on the radio, and she was waiting at the slip, which I appreciated. She took one look at Francis and didn't say anything, just held the door open and let us in. Her office was small and smelled like coffee and diesel, and there was a marine radio on the desk that was always on, always crackling. She had a space heater running in the corner. I sat Francis down in the chair by the window, and he sat without movement and looked out. "Okay," Hanson said. She crossed her arms. "Talk." So I talked. I laid it out in the order it happened, which I think is the only way to do it when there's a lot of moving pieces. I started with the forum images and the crew at Gruenke's and what Jackson told me about the net. I told her about Francis touching the figures, about the eye tracking him. I told her about the one that washed ashore, about the gill slits and the calcified nodules, about what I'd found when I cut into it. I watched her face when I said that part, and she didn't flinch, which told me she'd already been thinking along those lines. Then I told her about Hamilton, about the Ashland County Archives and the survivor's account, and the diagram of the diving bell and the 5 words in the margin. 3 knocks, they stop. I put my phone on her desk and showed her the photograph I'd taken of the page. She leaned in close and looked at it for a long time. 1929, she said. The Dominator went down in November of that year, Whitefish Bay. She straightened up. And you went to the wreck this morning. I reached into my collection bag and set the brass clapper on her desk. It landed with a solid thunk on the marine chart she had spread out there. She looked at it, didn't touch it. Hamilton left that inside the bell, I said. It had been there since at least 1929, probably longer. And she was quiet for a second, then the symbols. I don't know what they are. I photographed them. I haven't found a match. She looked at Francis. He was still watching the window. His pupils were still wrong. She looked back at me. And him? They made contact through the net. I think they've been using him as a relay since then, tracking me through him. I paused. He couldn't explain how he knew where the boat was. He just knew, and the gill slit appeared. I don't know when, sometime in the last few days. Hanson pulled a chair in and sat down across from me. She had a legal pad on the desk, and she picked up a pen and wrote something on it, then turned it toward me. It said, "How far along?" I didn't know. That was the honest answer. I didn't know what the stages were, or how fast it moved, or whether far along was even the right frame. I shook my head. She wrote, "Can he hear us?" I looked at Francis. He hadn't turned from the window. I said quietly, "Francis, what do you hear right now?" He said, "The water." We were inside with the marine radio on and the space heater running and the marina noise outside. There was no water audible in that room. Hanson capped her pen. She didn't write anything else. I told her I needed her to keep Francis here, under observation, while I figured out what the symbols meant and what the bell's signal actually did versus what Hamilton claimed it did. I told her she was the only local contact I had who was already read in, who had the authority to manage this quietly, without triggering a full agency response that would either bury everything or make it worse. She said she could do that. She said she had a back room she used for storm season cots that Francis could stay there. I said that worked. I trusted her completely. I want to be clear about that looking back. It wasn't careless. She'd been solid at every step. She'd been the one who took the form images seriously when I first contacted her. She'd been on the sand when the figure washed ashore. She'd kept everything contained. There was no reason not to trust her. I left Francis with Hanson and drove back to the motel in many pain. I sat on the edge of the bed with the clapper in my hands and looked at the symbols under the lamp. I didn't know what they meant. I turned it over a few times. 12 symbols total, maybe 14. Cut cut clean, deep into the brass around the grip. Old, deliberate. I set it on the nightstand and lay back and stared at the ceiling. Francis had said, the water, clear as anything, no hesitation. I kept that thought and didn't do anything useful with it. I just held it. The clapper sat on the nightstand, and I watched the ceiling and waited for something to come to me that didn't. I woke up at 2:47 because I hadn't actually been sleeping. I'd been lying on the bed staring at the ceiling with the clapper on the nightstand and my boots still on. That's me. Can't wind down. I'd been running the symbols through my head like I could decode them by repetition, which is not how that works, but I kept doing it anyway. I got up, used the bathroom, looked at my phone. Nothing from Francis, nothing from Hansen. I figured that was fine. I figured they were both asleep. I'm not sure what made me drive back. Some version of I should check. I do that sometimes. Not often enough, honestly, but sometimes. I grabbed the clapper off the nightstand, put it in my jacket pocket out of habit, and drove back toward the lake. It was cold. February cold even though it wasn't February. Lake Superior does that. The air coming off the water had that specific flat weight to it. The kind that gets into your jacket no matter what the jacket is rated for. I parked near the harbor master's building and walked around the side toward the water, and that's when I saw her. Jordan Hansen was standing waist deep in Lake Superior. No jacket, no boots. Still in her work clothes from earlier, the heavy trousers and the gray thermal she'd been wearing when I left Francis with her. She was just standing there, facing out, with the water up to her waist and her head tilted down at maybe a 30-degree angle, like she was listening to something below the surface. I stopped walking. I said her name. Twice. She didn't move. I stood on the bank for probably 10 seconds, which felt longer. The water was black and flat, no wind. The dock lights were on down at the marina, maybe a quarter-mile west, and they threw a little orange across the surface, but not enough to see much. Hansen was just a shape in the dark water. I went in after her. The cold hit my legs and kept going. I'm not going to dwell on it. It was bad. I waited out fast because moving was better than thinking about it. And when I got to her, I grabbed her arm and said her name again right next to her ear. Her head came up slow. I got in front of her and looked at her face, and that's when I saw her eyes. Fully black. Not dilated. Not the thing Francis had where his pupils were just too big for the light. This was different. The whole visible eye, iris, and everything just black. No reflection in them. Like looking at two holes. That part was hard to file away. I filed it anyway. I pulled her toward shore. She didn't fight me, but she didn't help either. She was just weight. Her feet found the bottom and she walked when I moved her, but she wasn't there. I got her up onto the bank and she stood on her own, barely. And then she spoke. I don't know what language it was. I don't know if language is even the right word. It was a sequence of sounds, some of them consonants and some of them not. And it went on for maybe 6 or 7 seconds. Steady rhythm, not loud. She wasn't yelling it at anything. She was finishing something she'd started underwater. I had the clapper in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and held it under the dock light and looked at the symbols on the grip, and I knew. I didn't know what they meant. I didn't know how to read them, but the sounds she'd just made and the marks on that brass were the same thing. Same source, same system. I was sure of it the way you're sure of things you can't prove yet. Then she collapsed. I caught most of her. We both went down on the bank, her mostly on top of me, and I got her turned over and checked her breathing. She was breathing. Her eyes were closed. I said her name again and slapped her cheek, not hard, just enough. She made a sound. Her eyes opened and they were pale blue again, the regular color. And she looked at me, and then looked at the water, and then looked at me again. What happened? She said. Not a question. More like she was running a check. You were in the lake, I said. She looked at her soaked trousers. I was in the lake. Yeah. She didn't say anything for a second. I watched her face. She was doing inventory, working backward and coming up empty. I don't remember going in, she said. I know. That was the moment I understood what I'd done. Not pulling her out. That was fine. That was the right call. I mean what I'd done the night before. Sitting across from Hanson and walking her through everything. The sleeper locations, the bell, Hamilton's account, Francis's exposure, all of it. I thought I was briefing a reliable contact. I'd actually been feeding information directly back to whatever had already colonized her. She'd been a receiver the whole time, and I'd handed her everything I knew, and she'd transmitted it while she stood in the lake at 3 a.m. with her eyes turned black. I didn't say any of that to her. She was still on the ground, and I was soaking wet, and there wasn't any point. Then I heard them. Movement in the water. Not waves. Not a boat. Something surfacing. The sound of water displaced from below. The specific weight of something large coming up. Then again. Then a third time from a different direction. 3 separate points, all of them close to the marina. I stood up. The marina was maybe 400 yards west. I could see the dock lights. I could see the shapes of the boats in the slips. 15 of them, give or take. The fishing fleet that ran out of Bayfield. Overnight moorings. Crews asleep below deck. 3 sleepers were between me and those boats. I had the clapper in my hand. Hamilton's note said 3 knocks. I didn't have a diving bell. I had a brass clapper and a steel dock wheel, and the approximate number of the That was it. I ran. The dock was wet, and I nearly went down twice. I grabbed the railing at the first fixed section, the heavy pipe railing along the main dock approach, and I struck the clapper against it 3 times. Even intervals. Not fast, not slow. The sound rang out flat and metallic across the water. 2 of them convulsed. I saw it. The shapes in the water, maybe 60 feet out, going rigid and then going under. Not graceful, just dropping. The water closed and they were gone. The third one kept moving. It was closer to the boats than the other 2 had been, already inside the marina approach, moving slow and steady along the surface. I could see the shape of it in the dock lights. 6 feet. Maybe a little more. Pale. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be fast. The nearest boat was maybe 30 feet from it. I struck the railing again. 3 beats. I heard Francis before I saw him. He was on the dock, maybe 30 feet behind me, which made no sense because he was supposed to be in Hanson's building. He must have followed her out, or followed me, or been pulled the same direction she'd been pulled. I don't know. I didn't know he was there until he made a sound, this short, sharp exhale, and I turned and saw him convulse. Both hands went to his sides and his back arched, and then he straightened and turned toward the water and walked off the end of the dock. No hesitation, no sound when he hit the water. It closed over him without a splash, which is not how water works when a person falls in, and that detail stuck in my throat and stayed there. I ran toward where he'd gone in. The dock ended. There was nothing below it but black water and the dock lights making orange shapes on the surface. I stood at the edge with the clapper in my hand and looked down, and there was nothing to see. The third sleeper was still moving toward the boats. I could hear it in the water. The sleeping crews were 30 feet away. Francis was somewhere below the surface. I stood there with the clapper and I didn't move. The third sleeper was maybe 20 feet from the nearest one. I could hear it. Not a splash, exactly. More like something displacing water that didn't want to be displaced. A low, steady pressure sound. The crews were asleep. Nobody on deck, nobody watching. Francis was under the water. I knew what the 3-beat signal meant. I'd watched it happen twice already. 2 sleepers convulsing, dropping back into the lake like something had cut their strings. And I just watched it happen to Francis. Standing 30 feet away on the dock, his back arching and straightening, and him just walking off the edge like he'd been asked to. No pain, no sound. I knew what striking the railing again would do to him. If he was still, if there was still something to do it to. That's the part I don't let myself think about too long. I didn't know if he was alive when I made the decision. I still don't know. I've turned that over maybe 1,000 times since, and I always end up at the same place, which is that I don't know, and not knowing is the part I have to live with. I struck the railing, 3 beats, same rhythm. The clapper was warm in my hand from the previous strikes, and it rang against the dock railing, and the sound went out across the water, and the third sleeper stopped moving. Just stopped. Then it went under. The water settled over it, and that was it. The pressure sound was gone. The lake went quiet in that way it does at 3 in the morning when there's no wind, which is a very complete kind of quiet. You can hear the boats creaking against their lines. That's all. I stood at the end of the dock for a while. I don't know how long. Long enough that my feet got cold through my boots from the wet dock boards. I kept looking at the water where Francis had gone in, which was pointless because there was nothing to see. Just the dock lights making orange shapes and the black water underneath them. He didn't surface. I waited. I'm not sure what I was waiting for exactly. Some part of me was running the math on how long a person could be underwater and still come back up, but the numbers weren't good. And I knew that, and I kept waiting anyway. That's me. I'll stand at the end of the dock in the cold for 40 minutes because I can't figure out what else to do. Eventually, I walked back to the parking lot. I still had the clapper. I didn't have anywhere to put it, so I just held it. Hanson was on the ground near her truck where I'd left her, sitting up, her back against the rear tire. She looked at me, and then at the dock, and then back at me. "Where's Francis?" she said. I didn't answer her. She figured it out from that. She didn't say anything else for a minute. Then she said, "I'm sorry." And I nodded because I didn't have anything to say back. The word sorry didn't really land anywhere useful. It just sat there. The next few days were administrative in a way that felt completely insane given what had happened, but that's how it goes. The world doesn't pause for you. Because Francis had joined Jackson's crew informally. No paperwork, no manifest entry, nothing official. There was no missing person report I could file. He wasn't on the boat's record. He wasn't anywhere on any record. He'd just shown up 3 weeks earlier and started working, the way Francis always did things. And that had seemed fine at the time, and now it meant I had no legal mechanism to account for him being gone. I tried anyway. I went to the Bayfield County Sheriff's Office on Broad Street and talked to a deputy for about 20 minutes. I told him a crew member had gone into the lake off the municipal dock. He asked for the name of the vessel. I said Francis wasn't on a vessel at the time. He asked for the manifest. I said there wasn't one. He asked for any documentation of Francis being in Bayfield at all. I said I didn't have any. He looked at me the way people look at you when they've already decided the conversation is over but are being polite about it. I left. I couldn't report what I couldn't document. That's a rule I know from No A, and it applies everywhere, apparently, including your brother. I drove back to the motel on Penny Avenue and sat on the edge of the bed for a while. The clapper was on the nightstand. I'd wrapped it in a hand towel from the bathroom. I didn't want to look at it, but I also didn't want to put it somewhere I couldn't reach it, so the nightstand was where it stayed. A week later, I got a call from a Park Service coordinator out of the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore Office. She said there was a fisheries observation position opening up at the Raspberry Island Lighthouse Keeper's Quarters, standard seasonal designation. She said my name had come up as a candidate. She said it in a way that suggested she was reading from something. I asked who had recommended me. She said she didn't have that information. I took the position because I didn't have anywhere else to go and because the lighthouse faces the lake and I wasn't done watching the lake. That felt like a reason. Around the same time, No AA sent a letter resolving the suspension. No explanation, no review board. Just a letter saying the matter had been closed and my credentials were reinstated pending reassignment. 3 months of professional limbo and then a form letter. I put it in the folder with everything else and didn't think about it much. I probably should have thought about it more. It was the Park Service courier who delivered the SS Dominator logbook, Parker Hamilton's full account, not just the excerpts I'd found at the Ashland County Historical Society. No explanation of where it came from or who had sent it. Just a padded envelope with my name on it and a Bayfield postmark. I was at the lighthouse by then. I read the whole thing in one sitting at the desk by the window. That's when I found the letter. It was folded into the back pages of the logbook, not Hamilton's handwriting, and not old, recent. It was a letter from Jordan Hansen to the NOAA regional director in Duluth, dated 4 years earlier, requesting that the original Madeline Island incident report, my incident report, the one that had gotten me suspended, be buried. Formally, quietly, completely buried. 4 years ago. I sat with that for a while. The sleepers' management of their exposure hadn't started 3 weeks ago when Francis touched the figures in the net. It hadn't started when the forum images went up. It had been going on for years, and Hansen had been part of it for years. And I had called Hansen the morning I arrived in Bayfield because I thought she was the only local authority willing to take the images seriously. I'd handed her everything. I'd briefed her on the bell, the wreck, the survivor's account, Francis's exposure. I told her where I was going and what I'd found and what I thought it meant. I thought she was a reliable, contained resource. That's the phrase I'd used in my own head. Reliable, contained resource. I'm not great at reading people. That's a thing I know about myself and apparently keep needing to relearn. The fluid from the dead sleeper's gill slits had soaked into the sand at Hansen's feet during the examination at the beach. I'd thought that was incidental at the time. I'd been wrong about a lot of things at the time. I set the letter down on the desk next to the clapper and looked out the window at the lake. It was a clear afternoon, flat water, light coming off it in a way that made it look harmless. It always looks harmless. The logbook was still open in front of me. The last entry in Hamilton's hand was a single line at the bottom of the final page, written smaller than the rest, like he'd almost decided not to write it at all. The bell does not stop them. It tells them to wait. The logbook sat open on the desk and I didn't close it. I'd been sitting there maybe 20 minutes since I read Hamilton's last line. The clapper was right there, 6 inches from my right hand. Brass gone dull in a few spots where I'd handled it too much. I kept not touching it. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I just didn't want to pick it up and feel how ordinary it was. It's a small thing. Heavy for its size, but small. Fits in one hand. I kept thinking about that. How something that small had done what it did on the dock that night, and what it had cost to use it. The lake was flat outside the window. It was late afternoon, getting toward evening, and the light was doing that thing it does out here where it goes gold and quiet and looks like nothing in the world could be wrong. I've been at the Raspberry Island Lighthouse for just over a week. The Park Service set me up in the keeper's quarters, which is basically a bedroom, a small kitchen, a desk, and a bathroom with a shower that takes about 4 minutes to get warm. The logbook arrived the day before yesterday. A courier in a green Park Service jacket knocked, handed me a padded envelope, and left before I thought to ask who sent it. No return address, no note inside. Just the logbook wrapped in acid-free tissue, which is a very specific choice that told me someone who knew what they were doing had packed. I'd read the archived account of the Ashland County Historical Society. That version was careful. Hamilton had been careful. But the full logbook wasn't the same document. The archived account was the version he'd let people see. The logbook was the version he'd written for himself. Or maybe for whoever came after, except he'd never quite committed to that either. You could feel him pulling back every few pages, writing something, and then stepping around it. The margins were fuller in the logbook. More diagrams, more notation in that cramped, deliberate handwriting. He'd been a precise man, precise and scared, and not sure how much to say. The emergence timeline was in there plainly, plainer than anything in the archived account. He'd written it in the logbook without the hedging, the sleeper surface on a cycle of 7 years, measured from the previous emergence. Not may surface or appear to surface at intervals. Just 7 years. He'd done the math from 2 prior sightings he'd cross-referenced from other ship logs and written the calculation out in the margin with the kind of neat, careful arithmetic of someone who wanted to be sure they weren't wrong. He wasn't wrong. The previous emergence was this one. The one with the net, the fishing crew. Francis touching the figures in the water. The dead sleeping on the beach. That was the clock starting. 7 years. I wrote it on a notepad and then looked at it for a while. 7 years sounds like a long time until you think about how fast the last 3 months went. I was suspended in March. I drove north in June. It's August now. That's how fast time moves when you're not paying attention. I flipped back through the logbook again, not looking for anything specific, just going through it. Hamilton had survived the SS Dominator by locking himself in the diving bell on the crane deck and staying there until morning. He'd written about the knocking, the rhythmic knocking from below the lake floor before the creatures surfaced. He'd written about the crew. He'd written about what he'd seen them do to the crew. And I'm not going to write that part down here, because it doesn't help anything to have it written down again. Some things you read, and then you just carry on. The note in the margin of the diving bell diagram. 3 knocks, they stopped. That was in the archive account too, but in the logbook there was more info. He'd written, stops them for a time only. They do not leave. They wait below. I have not found what ends them, if anything does. I have found only what makes them pause. That was it. That was what he knew and hadn't written plainly in the version he let the Historical Society archive. I understood why. Writing it plainly meant writing what I now know, which is that the bell works, and using the bell costs something. And the cost isn't abstract. It's specific, and it's permanent, and it has a name. Had a name. Francis. I hadn't said his name out loud since that night on the dock. I don't know if that's some kind of avoidance or just that there's no one here to say it to. The keeper's quarters are quiet. The island is mostly quiet. There's a Park Service maintenance crew that comes over by boat twice a week, and they're friendly enough. And I've had exactly 2 conversations with them, both about the water heater. That's fine. I'm not great at those conversations anyway. I closed the logbook. I didn't put it away. I just closed it and left it on the desk. The thing I kept coming back to, sitting there with the light going gold outside the window, was Hansen. Not the Hansen standing waist deep in the lake at 3 in the morning with her eyes gone black, speaking in something that matched the symbols on the cloud. I processed that, more or less. What I kept coming back to was the other Hansen, the one who'd taken my call when I arrived in Bayfield, who'd met me on the beach and stood there with a flashlight while I measured the dead sleeper and photographed its gill slits, who'd listened when I briefed her on everything. The bell, the wreck, Hamilton's account, Francis. I'd thought she was a reliable, contained resource. I'd used that phrase in my own head and felt good about it. She'd written to the NOAA regional director in Duluth years before I drove north. Years. The Madeline Island incident report, my incident report, the one that got me suspended. She'd requested it be buried before I'd ever heard of Bayfield. The colonization hadn't started 3 weeks ago with Francis and the net. It had been running for years, and Hansen had been in place, and the sleepers had been managing their exposure the whole time. I drove up there thinking I was ahead of the situation. I was the last person to know what was happening. I'm not great at reading people. I've known that about myself for a long time. I'm good at data. I'm good at patterns and data. People are a different kind of pattern, and I miss things. I missed Hansen completely. I told her everything I knew and handed her the entire picture and thought I was being strategically smart about resource allocation. I was handing them a map. The letter from the NOAA regional director was still on the desk next to the logbook. The suspension was resolved. Quietly, The way things get resolved when someone decides it's easier to bring you inside the tent than to keep explaining why you're outside it. I hadn't responded to it yet. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with the assignment. The fisheries observation designation, the lighthouse, all of it. It was a real job with real tasks, and I'd been doing them. I'd also been sitting at this desk every evening looking at the lake and thinking about 7 years. The water outside was going dark now. The gold light was gone, and the lake had turned that deep blue-gray it gets in the hour before full dark. Flat and still. No wind tonight. From up here in the keeper's quarters, I could see a long way out, and there was nothing on the surface, just water. I picked up the clapper, turned it over in my hand. The symbols were on the handle, carved in lines I still couldn't read. I'd photographed them and sent the photographs to 3 people I knew from the linguistics contact list I built years ago for a different project, and none of them had gotten back to me yet, and I wasn't sure they would. Hamilton had known what the bell cost. He'd survived by using it once, in the diving bell, on the crane deck of a sinking freighter in 1929, and then he'd spent the rest of his life writing around the truth of it. I'd thought that was cowardice when I first read the archived account. I didn't think that anymore. He'd written it obliquely because writing it plainly would have required explaining the cost, and explaining the cost would have required someone to read it and understand that the cost was real and specific, and that they might one day be the one paying it. He'd decided not to put that on anyone else. I understood that now in a way I hadn't before. I'm not sure I agreed with it, but I understood it. I set the clapper back down on the desk, left my hand on it for a second, then took my hand away. 7 years. The logbook said 7 years, and the math was clean, and I had the clapper, and I had Hamilton's notes, and I had everything except the one thing I'd had on the dock that night that I hadn't understood I was using until it was gone. I knew now what stopping them costs. I knew it in a way that doesn't go away. The lake was still outside the window. Dark now, mostly. A few lights from the mainland, far off. Nothing moving on the surface. It wasn't waiting in any way I could see. It just looked like water. It looked like it always looks. Flat and cold and completely indifferent to anything I thought about it. But Hamilton had done the math, and Hamilton had been right about everything else, and the clock was running. I left the logbook on the desk. I left the clapper next to it. I went to the kitchen and made coffee because it was going to be a long night, and I had 6 years and 51 weeks to figure out what I was going to do when the water stopped looking still.